Hi everyone, welcome to my English Unlocked channel, your friendly guide to learning English in a fun and simple way. I'm Emma, and we are going to start a complete series of English language, a series you must have never seen like this before. So please don't miss any episode of this series, and I am sure you will get a huge knowledge of how to speak daily life English directly in many fields, such as in business, in medical field, in politics, for any kind of job interviews, and even in many more fields. Therefore, please stay connected with us.
And I'm Jake. In this podcast of first episode, we will explore the English language, its history, and how you can become more confident in speaking and understanding it.
This is episode 1, the story of English, how it all began. Today, we're going on a journey through time to discover how the English language started, how it has changed over the years, and why it keeps evolving.
That's right. Understanding the roots of English will give you a better idea of why it is the way it is today. So let's dive in and explore the fascinating story of English.
First of all, we will talk about the origin of English. So, Jake, where did English actually begin?
Good question, Emma. English started over 1,500 years ago. It comes from a language called Old English, which was spoken by tribes called the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. These tribes traveled across the sea and came to England from areas that are now modern-day Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. When they arrived, they brought their language, culture, and way of life with them.
Oh, then it means the English language didn't actually start in England?
Exactly. It's surprising, isn't it? Before these tribes arrived, the people living in what we now call England spoke Celtic languages. These Celtic-speaking people had their own rich history and culture. However, when the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes settled, their language slowly began to dominate. Over time, the Celtic languages faded in many areas, and Old English became the main language spoken in the region.
Wow. So, these tribes really changed the language landscape. And Old English sounds very different from the English we speak today, right?
Oh, definitely. If you heard Old English being spoken, you probably wouldn't recognize it as English. It had a completely different sound and structure. For example, the Old English word hus means house. While you can see the connection, the way it was pronounced was quite different from how we say house today. Another example is sunnight, which meant night, but was pronounced more like k-nicht.
That's fascinating. So Old English was the beginning, but what happened next?
Well, a lot changed over the centuries, but one of the biggest turning points was the Norman Conquest in 1066. But before we dive into that, let me tell you a bit more about Old English itself.
Sure, I'd love to know more.
Old English had a much smaller vocabulary compared to modern English. Most of the words were simple and connected to everyday life. People used words related to family, farming, nature, and basic needs. For example, words like mother, mother in Old English, earth, eord, and water, waiter, all come from Old English. Many of the words we use today for basic things can be traced back to those early times.
That's really interesting. So, people back then mostly talked about simple, practical things?
Exactly. Life in those days was centered around survival and daily tasks. So, their language reflected that. They didn't have words for advanced ideas or technologies because those things didn't exist yet. Another thing to note is that Old English borrowed very few words from other languages in its early stages, unlike modern English, which has borrowed from hundreds of languages around the world.
And what about the grammar? Did Old English follow the same rules as modern English?
Not at all. In fact, Old English grammar was much more complicated. It was more like modern German. It had something called inflections, which are endings on words that show their role in a sentence. For example, depending on how you used a noun, it would have a different ending to show whether it was the subject, object, or something else. These inflections made Old English more flexible in word order, but they also made the language harder to learn and speak accurately.
I see. So Old English grammar was much more detailed, and the endings of words changed depending on their use in a sentence. That does sound complicated.
It was. Over time, these complex inflections started to disappear. By the time Middle English developed, the endings on words became much simpler, which made the grammar easier to manage. But during the Old English period, you really had to pay attention to those word endings to understand and be understood correctly.
That's amazing. Were there different dialects of Old English, or was it the same everywhere?
That's a great question, Emma. Yes, Old English had different dialects depending on where you were in England. There were 4 main dialects: West Saxon, Mercian, Northumbrian, and Kentish. West Saxon eventually became the most dominant, especially because many important texts, including the famous epic poem Beowulf, were written in that dialect. But people in different regions would have spoken slightly different versions of Old English.
That's so interesting. So, even back then, people had different ways of speaking depending on where they lived?
Exactly. Just like today, where people in different parts of a country may have different accents or ways of saying things, Old English had its own regional variations. This variety made the language even more diverse. But no matter which dialect people spoke, the core of Old English was the same across these regions.
And did Old English influence any other languages? Or was it only influenced by these Germanic tribes?
Good point. While Old English was mainly shaped by the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, it also absorbed words from other languages over time. For example, when the Vikings arrived during the 8th and 9th centuries, they brought Old Norse with them. This added many new words to the English language. Words like sky, egg, and window all come from Old Norse. These Viking influences added richness and variety to Old English vocabulary.
It's amazing how English evolved by mixing with other languages. So, even before the Norman conquest, there were outside influences shaping Old English.
Exactly. And each influence added something unique. Without these interactions, English wouldn't be the complex and diverse language we know today. And speaking of changes, the Norman conquest was a huge turning point for the English language.
I'm curious, what exactly happened during the Norman conquest and how did it change the language? I'm curious, what exactly happened during the Norman conquest and how did it change the language?
Great question, Emma. In 1066, William the Conqueror, who was the Duke of Normandy in France, invaded England. After a famous battle called the Battle of Hastings, he became the King of England. This event brought a new ruling class of Normans who spoke Old French. As you can imagine, when the rulers of a country speak a different language, it starts to influence the language of the people. But let's dive deeper into that in our next segment.
Oh, the Norman conquest. I've heard of it, but why is it so important to the English language?
Great question. In 1066, William the Conqueror from Normandy, which is now part of France, invaded England and became king. This was a huge turning point because the Normans spoke Old French, and they brought thousands of French words into the English language.
So you mean English changed again?
Exactly. For nearly 300 years, the rulers of England spoke French. English continued to be spoken by ordinary people, but it absorbed a lot of French vocabulary. This period is known as Middle English.
Can you give us some examples of French words we still use today?
Sure, words like government, justice, court, and even beef come from French. In fact, many legal and political terms in English have French roots.
That's amazing. So, English became a mix of Old English and French?
Exactly. And by the late 1300s, English became the main language again, but it had changed a lot. One of the most famous works from this time is the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer.
Right. Chaucer's English is easier to recognize but still quite different from modern English. During this time, English grammar began to simplify. Complex endings on words, known as inflections, began to disappear. This made English easier to learn and speak compared to Old English.
Yes, and it wasn't just the grammar that changed. The way people pronounced words changed too. This shift in pronunciation is called the Great Vowel Shift, and it happened gradually over a couple of centuries. For example, the word name was pronounced more like name in Middle English.
Wow, I had no idea pronunciation changed that much. So, what happened after Middle English?
That leads us to our next segment, the transition to modern English.
Oh, so what caused that change?
One major reason was the invention of the printing press by William Caxton in 1476. With printed books, people across England could read the same words, which helped standardize spelling and grammar.
That makes sense. So, more people were reading, and the language became more consistent.
Exactly. Plus, during the Renaissance, many new words came from Latin and Greek. Words like science, theory, and philosophy entered English during this time. Exploration and trade also introduced new words from around the world.
And Shakespeare played a big role too, right?
Absolutely. William Shakespeare, in the late 1500s and early 1600s, introduced over 1,700 new words and phrases to the English language. Many of his expressions are still used today, like break the ice and wild goose chase. His work spread through printed plays and made English even richer and more expressive.
That's incredible. Shakespeare really shaped the language. And by the late 1600s, English had evolved into a form we can mostly understand today.
Right. And as English spread across the world, especially through the British Empire, it absorbed even more words from other languages. So Emma, have you think that why English continues to change?
Maybe because the world keeps changing?
Exactly. As society evolves, so does language. New technologies, cultures, and ideas bring new words. For example, words like internet and selfie didn't exist 50 years ago.
And English is spoken worldwide, so people from different countries add their own words and expressions.
Right. English is a living language, meaning it grows and adapts. That's why it can feel challenging to learn, but it also makes English rich and exciting. Global communication and media also spread new slang and phrases quickly.
Wow, amazing. So, to sum it up, English has had quite an adventure. From Old English brought by Germanic tribes, through the influence of French after the Norman conquest, to the global language we know today.
That's right, and it's still changing. The more we interact with the world, the more English grows and evolves.
Understanding the history of English helps us appreciate why the language works the way it does, and why learning it can be both fun and rewarding.
We hope you enjoyed today's journey through time. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we'll dive even deeper into the structure of English and how you can master it.
Thanks for joining us on English Unlocked. Until next time, keep learning and keep unlocking your English potential. And wait for next episode, thanks. Bye for now.